Volcker.
Thank you. Thank you, Don. Ladies and gentlemen, President Beenan, my old colleague from Wood Wilson School. When I walked in here, there was no mistaking what school I'm in at the moment. You don't keep your light under a barrel somehow. But let me start off being here by offering some congratulations. Somebody decided some months ago to schedule this conference at precisely this time, and given what's going on in the world, I think whoever that was, I assume Professor Dye gets a gold star for forecasting for a timely conference. Here we are, time events are forcing the Congress, the SEC, the investing public to face up for the need for accounting and auditing reform, and what better opportunity could there be for a group of interested people to get together to debate the issues and help form the needed consensus. But more broadly, as I thought about coming out here this afternoon, I wanted to congratulate the Kellogg School itself, because I think it does have a long-standing commitment to teaching and research in accounting. And what's unusual about that is that much of business education has concentrated in other areas that are immediately more fashionable and certainly more immediately remunerative for their graduates, or thought to be. You know, I think a lot of times business schools are spending most of their energy on teaching how to get around the rules instead of how to follow them. And I think there has been a loss of accounting discipline. I won't blame it all on the business school, but I think it's obvious there has been a loss of accounting discipline that is really fundamental to the effective functioning of our market system. And of course, I couldn't come out here without thinking, as I'm sure many of you think, to this conference, how ironic it is that we're meeting right alongside Arthur Anderson Hall under the leadership of the Leonard Spacek Professor of Accounting. From all I've learned in recent months, the Anderson firm in general and Leonard Spacek in particular once represented the best in auditing. They literally emerged from the Northwestern faculty, and Arthur Anderson represented rigor and discipline, focusing on the central mission of attesting to the fairness and accuracy of financial reports to its clients. The sad demise of that once great firm is, I think we must now all realize, not an idiosyncratic one-off event. The so-called Enron affair is plainly symptomatic of a larger and a systemic problem. The state of accounting and auditing systems, which we have so confidently set out as a standard for all the world, is in fact deeply troubled. And the concerns extend far beyond auditing itself. There are important questions of corporate governance. I know you're going to be addressing some of those at this conference. I will touch upon them only tangentially. But more generally, I think we are seeing the bitter fruit of broader erosion of standards of business and market conduct related to the financial boom and bubble of the 1990s. In the broad sweep of capitalistic history, that kind of development has precedence. Now, from one angle, we in the United States have been in a remarkable era of creative destruction. Rough and tumble capitalism at its best, bringing about productivity, transforming innovation in electronic technology and in molecular biology. And that all has bred optimistic visions of a new economic era, set the stage for an explosive expansion in financial values. In fact, as near as I can determine, the increase in wealth in the stock market and elsewhere in the United States in the latter half of the 1990s has no full precedent in human history in relative or absolute terms. Encouraged by ever-imaginative investment bankers yearning for extraordinary fees, companies were bought and sold with great abandon at values largely accounted for as intangible or goodwill. Some of the best mathematical minds of the new generation turned to the sophisticated new profession of financial engineering, designing ever more complicated financial instruments. The rationale was risk management, exploiting market imperfections. But I'm afraid more and more it became a game of circumventing accounting conventions and IRS regulations. Inadvertently or not, the result has been to load balance sheets and income statements with hard to understand and analyze numbers, or worse yet, to take the risks off the balance sheet entirely. In the process, too often, rising stock market valuations were interpreted as evidence of a special wisdom, a special competence, justifying executive compensation packages way beyond any earlier norms and relationships. It became an environment in which incentives for business management to keep reported revenues and earnings growing to meet expectations was amplified. What is now clear is that insidiously, almost subconsciously, too many companies yielded to the temptation to stretch accounting rules to achieve that result. Now, the reason I talk about that kind of background is to emphasize the pressures placed on auditors in their basic function of attesting to financial statements. Moreover, it's true that accounting firms themselves were caught up in that spirit and that environment. They wanted to generate revenues, to participate in the new economy, to stretch their range of services. More and more, they saw their future in consulting, where in the spirit of the time, they felt their partners could better leverage their talent and raise their incomes. You know, I have a special image of the role of the auditor. Maybe it's peculiar. But I look at the auditor as a kind of umpire or referee, mandated to keep financial reporting within the established rules. And like all umpires, it's not a particularly well-paid or well-loved role, certainly not well-paid relative to the stars of the game. The natural constituency, the investing public, like the fans at a ballpark, is not consistently supportive when their own interests are at stake. Matters of judgment are involved. Perfection can't be expected in every decision. When it comes a time that the players, with teams of lawyers and investment bankers, are in alliance to keep reported profits, and not quite so incidentally, the value of fees and stock options on track, the pressures multiply. And the auditing firm, the umpire, if the auditing firm and the umpire is itself conflicted, judgments almost inevitably will be shaded. Now, I don't mean that as a description of the whole of American business, but we've seen enough to know there is, in fact, a problem. Doubts, increasing doubts about the reliability of financial reporting now appear to be infecting investor decisions and stock market valuations themselves. Plainly, the time has come to act. Act in the interest of the investing community, in the interest of all of us, so to speak, that are sitting in the stands interested in seeing a fair game to support the reforms in financial reporting. And without rules, at the end of the day, there can't really be a game. Now, I realize change and constructive change is already underway in the marketplace. Directors and audit committees of public companies are surely more sensitive today to auditor conflicts and to the implications of aggressive accounting practices. CEOs and their CFOs have been put on notice that they should not expect to escape responsibility for lapses in financial controls and reporting. The accounting firms themselves are surely motivated to review their internal procedures. They have responded, to be sure not too happily, to client and investor concerns by shedding some of their consulting services, particularly high-tech systems work. But the issue we face today is whether those reforms in the market can go far enough and whether they will outlast the current spate of reported scandals. And I have to tell you, the past record affords little or no comfort on that score. In the face of earlier difficulties, accounting firms and their trade associations have clearly demonstrated their enormous lobbying power and successfully resisted meaningful reform. I cannot believe it's in the long-term interest of the auditing profession itself that we permit that pattern to be repeated. It's just that too much is at stake, because at its roots we are dealing with an issue fundamental to the efficiency and effectiveness of the market for capital, not just in the United States, but around the world. Now, the good news, of course, is that out of evident crisis there is an opportunity for change, and constructive change. I don't suggest there's any simple quick fix. Rebuilding faith in financial reporting will take time, and I've been more and more impressed as I've gotten involved in this matter that reform is an intellectual challenge as well as a business and political challenge. Consider that in terms of what I think of as the three pillars of reliable financial reporting. First are the accounting principles and standards themselves. Do they set out with clarity, logically consistent and comprehensive rules of the game? Rules that reasonably reflect underlying economic reality. Second are the business and auditing practices and policies designed to implement those accounting standards. Are those standards upheld by the auditors and translated in fact into accurate, understandable, and timely reports by individual public companies? Finally are the institutional structures to support reliable accounting and auditing. Is there a framework of legislation, regulation, and corporate governance capable of providing and maintaining the needed discipline? The succession of accounting failures, beginning even before the Enron affair and continuing literally week by week, indicates unambiguously the need for improvement in every area. My personal measuring stick of maybe a little bit parochial of a time of crisis is when accounting and auditing is on the front page of the New York Times every day for 86 consecutive days, we got a problem. The general case for international accounting standards has been clear to me for a long time. In a world of global finance, we have a strong interest in encouraging high-quality standards every place our own companies do business. We want to be sure foreign-based companies desiring access to our well-developed market provide the kind of information our investors want and need. We want to avoid distortions in the international flow of capital because of misinformation, inconsistent information, or lack of information. And not least, a single set of standards around the world would minimize compliance costs for companies. Now, the United States has practically taken the position in the past that those objectives could be reached quite easily by sticking to our own gap and demanding that foreign companies wishing to access our large market follow our rules. Now, I'd still like to think our oft-stated view that the U.S. standards are the most comprehensive and best quality in the world are true. But I have to tell you that mantra is no longer unchallenged. What has become indisputable is that the standards themselves, national and international, need review. And the goal must be not just consistent standards around the world, but better standards. Enron's collapse amply illustrates a range of sophisticated issues before standard setters today. The almost inscrutable complexity of derivatives, options, and other new financial instruments. I am told, as one illustration, that the FASB rule, the GAAP rule for derivatives and options now exceeds 650 pages, and that no living man understands it all. Beyond that is the emphasis on self-defined pro forma earnings, the subtleties of fair value accounting where there is no objective market, the proper treatment of share-based payments, and of special purpose vehicles, all very familiar to newspaper readers in recent months. Not surprisingly, it's those same areas that generate intense controversy and where standard setters meet the most resistance. Change in the United States as elsewhere has been slow, and suspicions of political compromise have damaged confidence in the process. Now, as chairman of the trustees of the restructured International Accounting Standards Committee Foundation, if you can believe that title, I, together with the other trustees, am responsible for appointing and financing the Expert Rulemaking International Accounting Standards Board. We are dedicated to protecting the independence of its decision-making, but consistent with that duty, I am required to resist the temptation, and I find it difficult, to express personal views on the substance of the standards. What I and the other trustees can do is urge close collaboration among the international and national standards setters, notably cooperation with the U.S. FASB, and all deliberate speed in those deliberations. I sense the past resistance of the United States to accepting international standards may be eroding a bit. What is more evident is that much of the rest of the world is prepared to work to that end, and in particular, the European Union has already made clear its intention by law to adopt international accounting standards after the year 2005. Now, to be successful and to be accepted in the United States, those standards will indeed need to be of high quality. They will need to be adapted to the business and financial realities of the 21st century. And I trust the present efforts of collaboration between the international and national standard-setting boards, including the one in the United States, will provide protection against parochial financial and political pressures undercutting progress. You know, one of the bits of good news in that respect is one of the members of the International Accounting Standards Board has recently been appointed, I don't know if it's promotion or not, he's recently been appointed chairman of our FASB. So we have a personal link as well as institutional links between the American standard setters and the international standard setters. Now, one of the main concerns of the standard setters here and elsewhere has been the extent to which the rules should be set out and particular applications illustrated in great detail. That's the present American approach, as illustrated in the 650 pages on derivatives. The alternative, the approach taken in the UK, is to emphasize the basic principle at stake, with the auditor responsible for its specific applications. Now, the lesson drawn by many from the Enron debacle, with all its abstruse games playing with the technical rules, has been the potential value of the principle-based approach. But one thing is true for sure. If we're going to adopt that approach, it will increase further the burden on the auditor for disciplined, independent, and dispassionate judgment. And those are precisely the qualities that recent developments have brought into question. Now, I fully recognize that neither the entire firm and certainly not an entire profession should be damned by the weakness of a few who have indeed given way to the pressures I described. But I have to tell you, it can't be a pure coincidence that within Arthur Andersen itself, the strong emphasis on non-auditing consulting work over the past decade paralleled its ultimately fatal loss of auditing discipline. I've seen enough of its marketing brochures, its compensation policies, its training approach, and its emphasis on revenue generation to recognize that it meant conflicts and distractions. None of that would be a surprise to Leonard Spacek. He preached the professional responsibility of the auditor, the responsibility that justifies his exclusive license to perform the required audit of a public company, to attest to the fairness and accuracy of a client's financial report to the investing public. Activities that would place that responsibility in jeopardy are simply inappropriate. Now, it seems to me the key to auditing reform is adequate support for that essential mission. One aspect of that should be the willingness of clients to pay fees commensurate with the responsibility inherent in auditing and with attracting the kind of talent required. More broadly, experience strongly suggests that the changes in attitudes and approaches we are seeing on boards of directors by management and by auditing firms themselves will need to be supported and reinforced by legislation if they are to be truly effective and lasting. Bills now in the Congress, sponsored by Republicans and Democrats alike, appear to accept the logic of a new oversight body operating under the general authority of the SEC. Just recently, the SEC itself has reversed its passivity and proposed at its own initiative and in general terms an oversight body within its own jurisdiction. Now, in one way or another, all those approaches reflect the heightened concern about auditing discipline and related areas of corporate governance. But there are important differences among the particular approaches, and I think those differences are crucial in determining whether we will have meaningful reform. And in considering the alternatives, I have urged certain litmus tests be applied. First, does the proposed legislation in fact provide real independence for the Oversight Board with the majority membership representing the public interest rather than industry perspectives and with an assured flow of financing? Second, will the new Oversight Board have the authority to oversee and as necessary modify professional auditing standards and controls to assure their adequacy, to conduct investigations, to review particular audits, and to impose or recommend to the SEC a range of penalties, ranging from reprimands to loss of license? Third, will the board be able to determine limits on consulting or other services provided to audit clients and others when such activities undermine focus on the priority responsibility for disciplined auditing? And fourth, does the legislation provide adequate funding to the SEC itself, given the need for skilled and experienced staff, adequate in numbers, to maintain effective review and supervisory responsibilities in today's hyperactive and complex market environment? In my judgment, those criteria are most fully met only by the bill passed by the Senate Banking Committee last week at the initiative of its chairman, Mr. Sarbanes, with a strong bipartisan vote. But I also have to say the window of opportunity may be closing. Fall elections shorten the congressional timetable. We cannot count, the past so strongly suggests, on industry support. I know there is room for honest debate on some of the specific legislative language, but the main points of a strong oversight body and the elimination of substantial conflicts should be inviolate to those seriously interested in reform. The recent initiative of Mr. Pitt, and particularly his crystal clear recognition of the deadly threat to confidence in our financial markets, is a welcome and strong step forward. But I do not believe a regulatory approach without specific legislative authority will be satisfactory. It's not only a question of real technical doubts about the ability of the SEC under existing law to delegate its authority to impose a range of penalties. More broadly, only fresh legislation is capable of clearly expressing the will of the Congress and the American public for meaningful and lasting reform. Given what's at stake for the credibility of our financial reporting, I trust that approach can and will be supported in the end by the administration and the SEC alike. Now, just a few words on corporate governance, which I recognize is a natural complement to auditing reform. Questions in that area form a large part of your agenda tomorrow, and I will be short. There is a consensus, I believe, on the need for a strong and technically competent audit committee made up of independent members of boards of directors. I happen to be strongly attracted to another concept that seems to be gaining support, but I won't claim anything like a consensus. That is the desirability for most large and complex public corporations to split responsibilities of the CEO from a non-executive chairman of the board. Both approaches would, I believe, provide more effective oversight, a reasonable check and balance on the strong and almost exclusive authority of the CEO, typical of many American companies. As our Secretary of the Treasury, Paul O'Neill, has in his characteristically forthright way emphasized, the prime responsibility for financial reporting lies with the boss. It is the CEO that sets the tone, nurtures the culture, and appoints the staff. If and when there's a failure to report fully and accurately, he should bear the consequences. I think there's a great deal to be said for that position. The question is, of course, how to implement it. An independent auditing committee and non-executive chairman can help provide a needed element of oversight, a counterweight to the pressures of management to dress up reported results for short-term gain. But I also have to say, more important than either of those particular reforms of corporate governance, in my view, are the excesses and abuses in the use of stock options for the management of established public companies. It is not too much to say that an approach originally justified as a means of aligning management with stockholders' interests has too often been distorted into a means of aligning stockholders to the interests of management. The value of one-way options capriciously reflects general market influences as much or more than the long-term success of management. In bull markets, they reward even subpar performance. They are capable of rewarding performance that is less impressive than an investment in U.S. government securities. We have seen instances of huge payoffs, even as a company heads for bankruptcy. In my judgment, one-way options simply cannot sensibly be defended in the amounts granted by some companies. My larger point is we can't count on changes in corporate governance to substitute for needed reforms of the accounting and auditing disciplines. After all, boards of directors are, and they should be, collegial bodies, typically closely attuned to and sympathetic with the chief executive officer. They are necessarily heavily dependent on management for information. Their independence and experience is invaluable, particularly on strategic issues and organizational questions, but their attitudes and aptitudes are not necessarily those of a skeptical auditor acting at arm's length in the interests of the investment community. So we have today an all too rare opportunity for significant and lasting reforms. The stage is set for an international effort to bring accounting standards up to date. The need for internal change in accounting firms to focus on their auditing responsibilities is now better recognized. The legislative process is well underway. I think when we observe what's been happening in recent weeks, the market itself, by its own erratic performance, is calling for action. There cannot be any point in resisting change, not at the expense of further undermining market confidence. Amid all the pressures to which they are subject, the auditing profession needs, most of all, in my judgment, a clear congressional restatement of its primary responsibility, not to management, but to the investing public. Inevitably, the legislative process is both difficult and time-constrained. What it particularly needs at this point is a considered judgment and visible support of all of those dispassionately and professionally concerned with guarding the integrity of our financial markets. And I have to say, what better setting could there be for that effort than here at the Kellogg School at its Accounting Research Center? You're carrying on a tradition set long ago in happier days by Arthur Andersen and Leonard Spacek themselves. Thank you very much.
Paul's agreed to answer questions.
I've agreed to accept questions.
We ask that you wait for the mic and give your name. C-SPAN is supposed to be here, so they ask that we do it that way. So Paul, you're in charge.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Richardson from the State of Wisconsin Investment Board. You mentioned that moving towards perhaps a standards accounting system as opposed to a rules-based system like we have in the U.S. versus what they have in the U.K. Despite the fact that it might put additional burdens on the auditors, do you see us moving to that standard in the U.S.?
That's a very good question, which my remark that I will listen to the question without necessarily giving the answer applies. Because, you know, I've been a banking regulator for a long while, and the same issue kind of arises. And you have a certain skepticism that develops over the years whether, in the great American tradition, they are willing to follow principle as opposed to a rather specific rule. And it's generated in part by the litigiousness of our society, without any question. People like a nice bright line rule so that they don't find it quite so easy to be sued or have quite such muddy circumstances. So how this works out, I don't know, but there is sympathy in the United States, I think in FASB itself, and in the Congress. I get this when I go to the Congress now. Whether it lasts or not, I don't know. But given what went on in Enron and all the complexities, they say, yes, there ought to be more emphasis on principles. And I think in the Sarbanes bill itself, it has some reference to that. I would like to believe that's possible. I think it will take a very strong auditing profession to act in a manner in which they have not acted when the tradition has been to look for the specific rule to make that possible. I think it is possible you will get a statement of principle, and it'll be more than a statement of principle. It won't be 650 pages, but let's say it'll be 50 pages on some particular area. And you may have a somewhat different practice developing in the United States where FASB may want to, they'll accept it, there'll be agreement, but they may want to amplify it in their traditional way, whereas the Europeans will not, and leave it up to the auditors, and then we'll see what happens. It's not ideal, but I think it's a very difficult question.
Mine Chinar from the Loyola University Chicago.
Excuse me?
I'm sorry. Mine Chinar from Loyola University Chicago. I'm just saying my name and my institution. You talked about executive compensation and the problems with one-way options for the executives. Can you give us a framework for what sort of a two-way option that you're thinking about?
What kind of options am I talking about?
You did not like one-way options,
No,
so I'm
that's right.
thinking you liked either a two-way or three-way options.
Yeah, I do. I want a two-way situation, but not exactly an option. I really don't see what these options provide in terms of aligning incentives that are not better achieved by giving them stock and having them hold stock over a period of time so they can't kind of cash in when the stock reaches a high point and après exercise la deluge. I think it's a good idea for management to hold stock, and they ought to be encouraged to hold stock, and they maybe ought to be encouraged to be given stock. But let's have them hold the stock and take the bumps down as well as the increase up. Even then, I think there is a limit as to how much you want to make their pay dependent upon the foibles of the stock market. But to some extent, it strikes me as a good idea, but I wouldn't do it by one-way options.
My name is Ken Yip. I'd like to ask you, could you comment on the government's case against Anderson and
The
government's case against Anderson?
Oh, the government's case against Anderson? No. As you know, I was somewhat involved, or you may know, I was somewhat involved in thinking we might reform Anderson and escape this fate. It didn't work out, and I think that's disappointing because I think it would have been a good example of reform. And given the concerns that exist, the hope was that if Anderson could, and given its history, good and bad, but I'm thinking of the good part, it could have been an example of restored leadership for the industry that would have, competition in itself would have forced followership given the skepticism that exists so widely now. Now, the government chose to indict them. At that stage, I frankly thought it was beyond my limited competence and that would have to be fought out and decided in the courts. I think it had an unfortunate result from the standpoint of reform, but I can't comment on the merits of the case, one way or the other.
Yes, Sheila Weinberg, I'm a legislative advisor for Congressman Kirk. In an ideal world, how would you foresee the International Standards Board working with FASB, working with GASB, and also working with the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board?
Well, the ideal world is what we've been trying to create. I had nothing to do with the reconstruction of the International Accounting Standard Committee Foundation, but I was asked. It was led in part by Arthur Levitt when he was head of the SEC, which surprised me, with the support of the FASB leaders, which surprised me further, because we had always been so proud of our own standards and said everybody else conformed to us. And I'm sure one of the factors behind it was the concern of certainly Arthur Levitt, but I think the concern of FASB itself, that there had been heavy congressional influence in affecting two important standards, namely expensing stock options and treatment of intangibles, two very important areas. And I don't think I'm putting words in their mouth. I don't think I'm putting entirely thoughts in their head. That forced them to rethink whether, from an independent standpoint, it would be helpful to have an international effort, because one person's political pressures cancel out another, I suppose, to put it very bluntly. In any event, there was some support in the United States for moving ahead, but they were very sensitive to the question that you raised, so that the board, the international board, has an elaborate system of liaison members to keep in close touch with the important national standard setters, most of all the United States. There is one member of that board who spends full-time, well, not full-time because he's supposed to be in London part of the time, but spends a lot of his time in Stanford, is that where it is? Connecticut, anyway, with FASB, and similarly with the European standard setters, with Japan and so forth. This is all part of an effort to get consistency, and they are jointly working on projects. In some of these important areas that I touched upon or touched upon elsewhere, they have joint task force, FASB and the international, FASB and the Europeans, with the knowledge or the hope that they'll all come together. Now that, in some ways, may slow the process, but you hope the end result will be better than anybody would have produced and more generally acceptable than anybody could have produced individually. So it's a big, complicated process, slow-moving, but FASB itself has been very slow-moving, so I'm not sure it's any slower than what they have. I don't think so under the current pressure, but that's the idea. And I think it will be helped by the fact that Bob Hertz, who was the chief technical partner of Price Waterhouse recently, Price Waterhouse Coopers, very well respected in the profession, was eager to be on the international board because he believed in this process. But then when they needed a new chairman for FASB, they went to him, reflecting the position that he has. But it is certain he has sympathy for international standards. So I think there's some real hope here that some progress can be made. It's not a black and white issue. If we could get 3/4 of the standards international, it'd be a big help.
Peterson from Kellogg. You and others have called for more outside and independent board directors, and so the question is where we find them. Now, there is a group of people, business school professors, who both say they know how firms should be run, as well as not working for firms. So my question is, do you expect to see more academics or similar non-business people on boards? And if so, why is this good and why is this bad?
Well, I'm in an academic audience somewhat, or an academic building, am I not? I always appreciate the insights and independence that academics bring to these boards and other activities in appropriate proportion. I think there is a real problem behind your question. All this emphasis on auditing committees, to take that specific case, who's going to serve on them? You know, on the one hand, boards of directors or chief executive officers like to have other chief executive officers on their boards of directors. And there is an argument they make good members of auditing committees because they have that kind of experience. But if you're a chief executive officer now, do you want to jeopardize your position by being on an auditing committee of another company and, you know, spend a few days a year on, and I'll tell you, you can't understand a complicated company's financial reports with the amount of effort that a typical auditing committee member is prepared to give. I have kind of a wild idea, which I decided is, well, it's not so wild an idea, but I'm not sure I have wanted to expose it in public. But since this question arises, I'm not sure we should not think of having the audit committee separately elected from the regular board of directors, and that is their only responsibility. They're going to hire the auditor, they're going to compensate the auditor, they're going to oversee the auditor, and there's no doubt about what their responsibility is, and they can report to the other directors. I raise that idea and people say, well, that's fine. Who's going to be on that auditing committee? One answer is, they're going to be academics that are going to be glad to be on that auditing committee. But I think you'll get retired. You're not going to get chief executive officers, but I'm not sure that's bad. You've got to have somebody that's willing to spend a lot of time.
Jack Duffy, Bloomberg News. The Europeans have argued strongly for expensing stock options. Do you get the sense that there's any momentum for change here? Any sense that FASB is willing to take another look at this thing, or Congress is willing to push in that direction? Well,
you know, I really am in a little bit of trouble here because I'm not supposed to comment on whether expensing stock options is a good idea or a bad idea, but I can give you some observations. There's no question that this issue is much more alive than it was a year ago. It's very alive, not just in Europe, and I think the predominance of professional opinion is certainly that they should be expensed somehow or another. I think it's increasingly true when I talk to some business executives that they don't want to say it in public, but they kind of understand that day may be coming and should be coming. But the business lobbying effort is still very much opposed. They had a powerful influence on the Congress 6 or 8 years ago when, wisely or not, the International Accounting Standards Board, the board that we appointed that sets the standards, put on their agenda at their first public meeting, not alone, but along with half a dozen other things, but they put on their agenda expensing stock options. This was long before Enron. I immediately got letters from congressmen saying, how could I permit them to do that? As if I could permit them anyway. I had that authority. But don't you understand that the U.S. Congress expressed an opinion upon that in all its majesty some years ago, and that is not a decision to be tampered with. Now, I don't think you're going to get quite that strength of attitude today, but there is still a lot of opposition. And I think where the issue is most sensitive substantively is with very small startup companies where you can make the best case that they want to give away some of their ownerships, okay. Now those companies are not public companies and wouldn't be affected by the accounting rule anyway. And of course the next stage, okay, in principle they ought to be expensed, how do you do it? And that's where a lot of people stumble. I mean, my position, frankly, has come to be what I said in my remarks. I think the stock options are just overused, particularly by big established companies. how can you justify an instrument when Enron executives walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars 6 months before the company went bankrupt? And, you know, it's not maybe the most egregious, obvious incident, but it's not the only one. You know, everybody made great benefits from stock options when you had a great bull market. When the market goes down, they reprice the options and you start the game over again. I mean,
Mr. Volcker, my name is Maury Kaplan. I'm a graduate of Kellogg way back when Arthur Anderson was on the faculty. Do you think that business schools should take an active, articulated position in trying to work out this mess? And if so, what kind of position, what kind of action do you think they might take?
Well, you know, I think it's a little late for business schools to get very much in this now. We're going to get a good decision in the Congress in the next couple of months, or we probably aren't going to get it. And business schools are on vacation probably over the summer. But I do think, and look, this is just an impression I have. Well, it's a little more than an impression, but it's a rebuttable impression, that business schools have found more glamorous things to emphasize in recent years than accounting and auditing. And you don't have many straight, I guess everybody has some kind of an introductory course in accounting, but it's not something that in most places has got a lot of emphasis. I did a little teaching at the Stern School part-time, which also has violet for some reason as its color, but and that school has come up, you know, a lot in prestige among business schools. And then when all this arose, I talked to the dean and said, well, you know, you used to be famous for turning out all these accountants. The Stern School, years ago, a lot of part-time students. She said, well, we don't do that kind of stuff anymore. And, you know, they didn't think that was a prestigious thing to do or whatever. And I think we're paying a little bit for that. And I suspect we will see some change as a result of what's going on. And we need a big intellectual input. There is no doubt in my mind about that. Accounting standards are very tough in today's complex world. How you deal with, you look at a big bank or a big financial institution, or even many industrial firms that have a lot of financial activity, and they've got trillions of nominal value derivatives and options on their books. And I defy any amateur like myself, but I defy almost any professional. Certainly by looking at the annual report, you cannot figure out what their risks are and what their exposures are in any reliable kind of way. It is a full-time profession. And instead, it is absolutely certain, and very active in business schools, the profession of financial engineering, it doesn't put the syllabus this way, but a large part of their raison d'etre is how can we think up fancy ways to get around accounting rules in the IRS. And so it's a cat and mouse game, and the mouse is a little ahead, I guess, of the cat. So I think business schools do have a real responsibility here, but I don't think they can help probably much in it. It would certainly help if leaders of business education speak out, and now is the time to speak out, right now.
Jeff Baring, Kellogg student. Kind of dovetailing with what you were saying, sir, would you comment on the idea of adding, which you're talking about, the European principled approach to the U.S. GAAP rules approach, such that, you know, you were saying something along the lines that if you're some kind of cat and mouse game with the IRS, you follow in the letter of the rule, but not the principle. If there was some kind of the principled approach to test whether the rule had been followed, together with maybe greater personal responsibility for those people who sign the financial statements, the auditor, and management and audit committee. I guess I'd like your comment if you can make sense of everything you just said.
As I said before, I don't know the real answer to this. You mentioned the IRS, where the same problem obviously arises, and the American tradition, and it's a little different there. You can argue you're entitled to thread your way through any IRS regulation. That's a right of citizenship. I'm not sure I'm enthusiastic about that, but I can understand that point. But I think for a business executive to find its way around the accounting rules, or for the auditor to accept that, is a little different, because the responsibility, they both have a responsibility to the public that seems to me to transcend fancy ways of perverting what the intent of the rule is. Now, how you deal with that, I don't know. As I said before, it'll be interesting to see. The chairman of the International Accounting Standards Board, who is a distinguished Scot, a lot of prestige in the accounting business, feels, he used to be the head of the English, or the UK accounting board that adopted this principled approach, and he is enthusiastic about it. He thinks that's the only way to go. And we will see. The only answer I can see is you can start out that way, and the United States may want to supplement it, and may have to supplement it. The other thing, which is very popular, and which to say, and I think more doable, and a lot of the auditors argue this themselves in one way or another, you shouldn't just have a black and white system that you followed the rule or you didn't follow the rule, a pass or fail grade. I don't think you can make it A, B, C, D either. You get a lot of grade inflation. But what you can do is force a discussion of borderline decisions. I mean, maybe Enron technically could have taken some of that stuff off the balance sheet, but it should have been explained and what residual risk there was more clearly, instead of a single obscure footnote for billions of dollars worth of this stuff. And you can, lots of times there's a choice. There are legitimately different ways with different risks of how to account for something. But the auditor ought to explain what choice was made and what the implications of that choice were. And I think all of that, makes the annual report even more complicated. But it reflects the reality that things are not really black and white, that they are matters of judgment in these areas. I think it would make the profession of auditing more interesting in the end, too. What's this, a double dipper here? This is a double dipper here?
Sorry about that. I just wanted to ask you don't seem to think much of Harvey Pitt's approach to accounting industry oversight as opposed to that of Senator Sarbanes. What is it about Pitt's approach that you don't care for?
Well, I think his approach has come a long ways toward accepting the need for I haven't read it in detail, but what seems to be a strong oversight committee. That's a big step on his part. And it came with a very strong statement about his concern about the growing distrust in the markets. What I don't like about it, coming as far as we are and given the nature of the problem, I'm told by lawyers that he may have a somewhat expansive view of what his own law permits in terms of delegating authority, residual authority they may have to another oversight board. And if you can't do that, it kind of neuters the oversight board. So that's kind of a technical point, which, if there's enough controversy about it, requires legislation anyway. But otherwise, I just think we have reached a point, given all the controversy that exists. And he himself has said he would accept that his is a temporary thing pending legislation. But I think to really kind of get a decisive decision here, we ought to have legislation. Now, I will take Pitt against very weak legislation. So it's not black or white, but I think if we have a chance for really strong oversight board, independently financed, not dominated by the industry, with disciplinary powers, that's what we have been lacking for a long time. And it's not dissimilar from what we've had in the securities industry, which we take for granted ever since 1933, but we've never had that in the auditing profession. And I think this expression of public congressional concern and action is important at this stage.
Let's call a halt, and Paul, thank you very much.
Yeah, all right.